Okay, today in the Shir, I'm going to try and answer a question, which may be a strange question, but it's a question nevertheless. And the question is, what exactly do we mean by the day of the Geula? We all know that the Geula will start at some point, and that's called the Geula Day. What exactly happens on that day? That's my question. In other words, most of us think that the Mashiach is going to come on that day, but I don't know if that's true. So the real question is, what is the most important thing that day represents? What is going to start on that day? Is the Mashiach going to come on that day, or is it something else? So in order to answer this question, which is a deep, very deep question, we have to go down to a deeper level and to review some of the material that we have and go to finally to that answer. So let's start. The most important thing that we're aware of, that God gave a gift and he derived the Zulasoi. What gift did he give to the Zulasoi? When it says that the Zulasoi is B'Tselem Elokim, that he is the image of God, what exactly does that mean? Because that's the actual gift that God gave him, the fact that he's in his image. So it's important for us to understand, what is that Tselem, what is that image of God? So what I believe, that image is really nothing but self-awareness. In other words, the statement, the Zulasoi is aware of himself by himself. That's the fundamental definition of self-awareness. In other words, his awareness of himself is through himself and by himself. That means he knows himself. And when he says, I am myself, the myself is the gift that God gave. Because God also has this concept. God is also nothing but a sense of self-awareness where he knows himself by himself. But the difference between God's self-awareness and our self-awareness is that we possess self-awareness. We have self-awareness. But God does not possess self-awareness. He is self-awareness itself. He is the act of self-awareness itself. Now, we cannot understand it. We can understand that something that you could possess, that you can have, but we cannot understand what it means to be it. And since God is self-awareness itself, he therefore gives it as a gift. And he creates a Zulosai by partaking of his self-awareness in certain ways as a gift. And that's what it means that that we are a portion of God. What portion are we? We are a portion of his self-awareness. So the actual question is, what exactly is self-awareness? And why is that such a great gift? Because the answer is, self-awareness is existence itself. In other words, you either exist or you don't exist. And how do you know you exist? So what logicians say, philosophers say, that existence is a process which is attached to the sense of self that you possess. In other words, that's your essence that you have a sense of self. And what that sense of self does, it delivers an action of self-awareness. Well, what about existence? Well, the truth is, as I've said many times, there's nothing about existence that we should be concerned with, because the process of existence does not appear. In other words, every human being and every object and everything in the universe does not exist because in some way it has a cause. And that cause, of course, is God. God is the cause of their existence, and existence is a process in which they are. But the truth is, existence can occur in two steps, from non-existence to existence. So existence is possible for existence to be absence. So what does it mean that God exists? What it means that God is not really existence. He's not a process. God is actually, I would call, a manifestation. So his existence is necessary. And what is existence itself? How does it occur? It occurs through the process of self-awareness. How do you know that you exist? Simple, because when you close your eyes, you suddenly become aware of one critical feature, and that's self-awareness. Your self-awareness is the actual point that you exist. So therefore, fundamentally, what you are is a sense of self, which gives you existence through self-awareness. So self-awareness is not a process which is separate from the person. The person has a process of self-awareness, and that tells him that he is. So in other words, existence is nothing more than self-awareness, consciousness. That is existence. That is your manifestation, and that's how you know that you are. You are conscious, and your consciousness tells you fundamentally that you exist. And that's all that is really. So therefore, we have reduced the concept of existence to the concept of consciousness, which is the act of self-awareness that you are. And this is a gift that God gave. Why is this a gift? Because this is a gift that somewhat mirrors him. Just like God is the entity of self-awareness itself, God allowed us to partake of this feature, and therefore we also are self-aware. So in that sense, through our self-awareness, we mirror God, or we reflect an image of God, and so on. So this is the ultimate gift. Now, there are other things which seem to possess an aspect of self-awareness, but it's not really the case. Like, for example, animals are self-aware. But where is that self-awareness? Do they have a consciousness? Do they have a mind like a human being has? I don't believe so. What animals have is self-awareness, which is connected to the perception of reality. They perceive that they are self-aware in reality. But the human being, the Zulosoi, really, he has a self-awareness which is outside of reality. In fact, reality is formed from a sense of self, from a sense of self-awareness. Reality comes through the eyes and through the sensory organs and so on, and it produces an image of reality in his brain. And that's what he sees. Sight is nothing more than the ability to connect to something, to an image that your brain produces about reality. But what reality is, you will never know, because all you are in touch with, all you are in contact with, is the image of reality in your brain. So therefore, we say that the Zulosoi has a form of centrality. All reality proceeds from your mind. And your sense of self-awareness is aware of what your mind has produced or what your mind contains. It's not, your mind is nothing more than the continuous flow of images in reality. That's all you are. That's all you ever will be. Because fundamentally, you are the gift of self-awareness. And that's the key to your centrality, and that's the key to your existence. So this is the greatest gift that God ever gave, and that's the human being, the Zulosoi, is the recipient of this gift. Now, from this gift of self-awareness, there stems a very big problem. And that's the problem called Nam Sufa in Aramaic, which means bed of shame. What is that problem? That problem is that since I know myself by myself, I am therefore nothing more than a myself. That is myself. And the fact that it's it exists seems to indicate to me that in some way I am somewhat outside of God, because I see myself as outside of him. I know myself, and therefore, since I know myself, I feel in knowing myself that I'm independent or outside of God. And this is the problem of Nam Sufa. Because the centrality of a person, the fact that in a certain sense, he is the fundamental recorder of all reality, he is central to reality. And therefore, the fact that he's aware that there's something outside of him through the word me. When a person says the word me, automatically that implies the word you. Me implies you. So therefore, when he looks at God, he sees God as a you, as something outside of him. So the self-awareness of a person appears to be independent of God, in which you can see God as an act of his mind. And he sees everything in reality as an act of mind. What does this do? What this does is this empowers the person. It makes it feel, since the sense of self creates an empowerment, because it makes you central to all reality, since you produce reality in the images in your brain, the fact that you know that there's something outside of you, that there's another self, this empowers the centrality of yourself. So therefore, by seeing yourself as a me, you feel disempowered. What about God? Does God sense himself as a me? No. Why? Because God is the act of self-awareness itself. He is the act of being me. He doesn't possess the quality of me. He is the act of being me. So therefore, he includes everything. In God, there lies everything, and that's what it says in the Torah, Einoi Vadoi. There's nothing else but God. In other words, God is the only being with a sense of self and truth, because he is an act of self. He is the very act of self-awareness itself. We possess self-awareness. So that gives us the illusion that there's something outside of us. Now, this creates a certain problem. This creates a problem in a certain sense, not for God, it creates a problem for us. And because of the fact that God contains everything, Ein Oid, the statement Ein Oid, there is nothing else, applies to God. And that even includes us, that we are not truly outside of God. We are inside of God, and therefore God is not a you. God is in the inner me. He is the foundation of my self-awareness, because in a certain sense, I share a certain aspect of his self-awareness that he projected from himself to become my self-awareness, and therefore I know myself. But the problem with this is that we have a self-awareness which sees God as outside of me. And this creates a major problem of what? It creates the problem of annihilation. Because even though God blessed me by giving me a manifestation to some extent similar to him, like it says, we are slightly less than God, but it creates a problem for us. Because since I possess the illusion that I am outside of God, I therefore see myself as an exception of what God includes. Because in actuality, I see, my perception is that God does not include me in himself. I see that God has a perception of me like I have of God. He is outside and I'm outside of him. So if our relationship one is of me, you. But I am not included in God's in God's being. I don't come from God. I am outside of him. The sense of myself and self-awareness is outside of his sense of self-awareness. So I see us as a duality, as two separate beings. And this threatens my existence. Because the nature of God, if he has a nature, and he doesn't have a nature, is that God includes everything. There is nothing outside of him. So when I, who have a certain sense of self-awareness, think that he is outside of me, I am creating a fiction, an illusion, something which cannot be. And therefore what results is a certain pressure that emanates from God. It's called yichud pressure. It's the pressure that emanates from his unity. And it says, there is nothing outside of me, including you. And that pressure is a destructive pressure. It must annihilate me, because I fundamentally am an untruth. My perception of him as outside of me is untrue. And there's nothing untrue that can exist in God's manifestation. So therefore, from God there comes a force which must annihilate me. So therefore, we see a certain dilemma that God, in a certain sense, has. That even though God loves me and wants me to be, he wants to give me the gift of being by giving me the gift of a sense of self through my self-awareness. At the same time, that self-awareness, which makes me feel independent and outside of God, threatens me. So as soon as he derives me from him, God does not create me, because you cannot create something outside of yourself. God creates me only in the sense that he derives myself from him. He does not create me, which means he creates me from nothing. I cannot be created from nothing. My sense of self cannot be created from nothing, because it sees God automatically as a you. And God cannot create a you. But since I have a perception of myself as outside of God, I'm in trouble, because I perceive in a way which is an illusion. It's false. But I can't help myself, because if I see myself as me, I have to see God as you. God knows this. And therefore, what God says, the most important thing for him is to keep us in existence, in the manifestation. God wants us to be. He wants to give us the gift of being. But that gift of being is impossible if I think that I exist outside of him. So therefore, what he wants is me to harmonize my existence with his existence. And what does that mean, to harmonize? Instead of seeing myself as a me and him as a you, God wants me to see, besides the me of you that you are, he is an inner me. He is the foundation of you. And therefore, he's an inner foundation, which is the basis of the concept of me that you say about yourself. So a human being or the Zulasa is really therefore capable of two perceptions. He's capable of perceptions where he calls himself me, and he calls him God, because of that, you. And that is a forbidden perception. That perception leads to his yichud pressure, annihilating me. But he wants me to convert that perception to a perception of truth, which is what? That God is not outside of me. God is my foundation. I share an aspect of God's self-awareness, and that's his great gift to me. So he wants me to what? He wants me to develop the true perception of him in his relationship to me. God doesn't really have any relationships. Why? Because since God contains everything, he doesn't have anything which is outside of him. So therefore, if you don't relate to anything outside of you, because there is nothing outside of you, you are incapable of a relationship. But it's a quasi-relationship. God has a quasi-relationship. And what God wants, fundamentally, is to love him. Why? Because you have to understand what the emotion of love is. Since we will always see God through our sense of self-awareness, and we always will see God as a you, how can we give up that false perception? The only way we can give up that false perception is by love. Because when you love someone truly, you see that person not as outside of you, but you see that person as you. One definition of love that I once read was simply, when a person puts his hand on you, let's say when your wife puts her hand on your chest, that hand of hers is not outside of you. That hand is you. That's what love means. That the existence of the other person is really part and parcel, not of your consciousness. It's not simply that you're aware of that person, like you're aware of everything else, which is called an object. When you're aware of the woman you love or the woman you love, then you are aware of somebody who is actually part of you. And therefore the concept of love as applied to God solves the problem, the disempowerment of the bread of shame. But when you love someone, you don't see him as outside of you, you see him as inside of you. You share his awareness as if it's outside of you. And that solves the problem of Namlik Sufa. And that's what God says to the Zulosai, who's the recipient of Olam Haba, the future world, eternal world. I want you to develop the consciousness of union, the consciousness that you and I are unified together, where you can then love me as I love you. And if you develop that consciousness, you will no longer see me as outside of you. So you have to develop a consciousness of union, that you and me together in a certain way are unified. And I want you to leave the consciousness of separation, which you have because you have a certain sense of self. Your self-awareness gives you the feeling that you are separate from me. So therefore, what I want you to have is the awareness of union, that you and I are together in a certain sense as an organism. I don't want you to see me as separate from you, as outside of you, because that will excite my consciousness of annihilation. So even though I have created you with such a feeling, the only way you can actually coexist with me is how? Is by loving me. Because that does not deny the fact that I am in you, I am your foundation. But the consciousness or the awareness of separation does deny that. And you have to harmonize yourself with me through loving me. And the way you have to love me is by performing my commandments. I'm going to create a situation for you where suddenly you can see both possibilities. And in a certain way, I'm going to separate your self-awareness from both of these possibilities. I'm going to separate your sense of self from your sense of self-awareness. I can do that because I derived you from me. So I'm going to separate your sense of who you are as self from the result of that self, or the conclusion of that self, which is called self-awareness. And I'm going to have you choose between what kind of awareness you want. I'm going to give you a lens which will show you a world of separation, where everything is separate from each other, where everything is individual and completely isolated from something else. And I'm going to call that world the physical world. In the physical world, you will see everything from your senses. And what you will see in your self-awareness will make it known to you that every object is separate, has a separate definition, has a separate existence. And the lens that will supply that is your body. It's called a body, because your body will possess 5 senses. Your eyes to see, your nose to smell, your ears to hear, your tongue to taste, and your hands to touch. And you will see, you will have self-awareness through these five senses. And these five senses will create an image on your mind, which you will see in your mind, and then you will become aware of reality. At the same time, I'm going to create another world. It's a spiritual world. It's the world of spirit, where you see everything as connected. When you see something, you will not only see it as an image in your mind, you will understand its meaning, just like you see your thoughts. How do you have a thought? A thought is simply a predication. It's when you affirm or deny something of something else. That's called a predication. When you have a thought in your mind, you have a predication. You suddenly realize something about something else. But you see that as a thought. It's not an image. It's not an image in your brain. It is a kind of image, but it's a thought image. It's not a sensory image. And as a soul, which I will give you, is the lens where you will see everything in its connection to everything else. So what the soul sees, the soul is a lens. It allows you to see reality. But the reality of the soul is a reality of connections. You will see automatically, as you see something, not only the fact that it is, but you will understand its meaning and its relationship to you. So as soon as a soul sees another soul, it instantly knows who that soul is. That's right. There's no such thing as an isolated individual in the world of spirituality. There are no individuals, really. It's really a total organism. The world of spirituality is a total organism, where you see every other soul in its connection and its relationship to you. Only in the world of physicality, the world of the body, which is a lens which indicates that reality is separate from each other. Every object is separate. In that world, you will see, you will have the awareness of separation. But as a soul in the spiritual world, you will have the awareness of unity, the awareness of meaning of relationship. And I will make you a combination of both body and soul, where I will place your soul in your body, and the two will be united forever, the body and soul. So that when you solve the problem of separation, finally, when you realize that I'm inside you and not outside of you, and time in that world will stop, you will be in the world of eternity. And your body as an instrument of separation and your soul as an instrument of union will both disappear. And you will become pure self, pure consciousness, which is what you really are. You will return to the consciousness. In the physical universe and in the spiritual universe, you are body and soul connected together, where you can have two possible perceptions. In order to create the possibility of these two perceptions, an awareness of union and awareness of separation, your body and soul, two lenses, must be united. But the more important lens, which is difficult for you to understand, is your body. That's right. Because your soul sees everything in unity. It sees the connection. But when you see that, that's really what you're seeing the way I see things, where everything is part of me. So your soul, in a certain way, replicates the vision or the awareness of God. It's your body that reveals to you who you are, that you are a sense of self with the image that you're outside of everything else. But that's only an illusion. But that illusion provides you a sense of self. Your true sense of myself comes from your body, that you are individual to everything else, and that you are yourself. You are a me, and as a me, you're only yourself. And that is the gift I gave you. So your body contains really the gift that I gave you, not your soul. Your soul possesses the gift from me in which I see things, connections, relationships in a certain way. But your body is the one who then individuates you as a lone, isolated, separate person. That is the me or the myself, and that is my gift to you, just like I possess myself. So therefore, I'm going to put you in a new universe, a new olam. And that universe is a physical universe with the spirit universe inside that. So therefore, the human, the Zulasa, will be a combination of body and soul. And your purpose, while you're in the thing, is to do the commandments that I tell you to do. Because that's your declaration that you really are unified with me. You are part of me, and I am part of you when you do my commandments. When you oppose your body and have self-control, you will be doing what I say, because in every different physical impulse, I will also give you commandments of to do or not to do them. So therefore, if you don't eat what I tell you not to eat, it's your declaration that you're listening to me because you are really part of me. And that will reestablish your love of me. And therefore you will not be annihilated by using pressure. But that's only if you listen to your soul. Because your soul will tell you through your mind and your thoughts that you should keep what I tell you. You should do my commandments. Why? Because you are derived from me, and I am your foundation. Your soul will reveal that to you. But your body will reveal a different sense of who you are. It will reveal a sense which is titled me. And you will think that that sense of me is outside of God. And God is a you. So therefore we see that both body and soul are two lenses which create this universe, which produces two things. The body creates the theme of me and you, that I'm outside of you. And therefore, that's what's true in the physical world. That's the truth of existence in the physical world. But you will have another existence called the soul, which is inside your body and attached to your body. It will have the perception of something else, where everything is connected to you, where I am your foundation. And you will have to choose between these two lenses. And if you choose between the lens of the soul, if you choose that lens, you will one day become what? You will become united with me as an organism, and you will be in love with me as I love you. And you will be safe. Safe from what? Safe from my yichud pressure. Because since you love me and you do not see me as a true outside, but sees me as part of you, you will be safe, and you will not be threatened by the fact that I have no outside. Because you won't even declare that. You will not declare yourself that you are outside of me. You will declare that I am inside you, and you will be safe. So that's the reason why I give you my commandments, so that we can develop a relationship, and that's the most important thing in life. The most important thing in life is our relationship between you and me. That I am part of you, I am your foundation. And therefore you will no longer be subject in time and space, which is necessary to create the physical universe and the spiritual universe, where through time you can produce changes. You can go from one perception, the association of what? Of separation, to the association of unity. You will have the awareness of separation to the awareness of unity. And that's what I want. That's the consciousness I want you to develop. So you need time to do that. You need a past, present, and future, where the past is one perception and the future is another perception. And that's what time is. You also need space, because you need to have a sense of space between you and another person or you and another object. That creates a feeling of separation. So what supports the feeling of separation and individuation is the concept of space. So that's why when I created the physical universe, and to some, I created a concept of time and space. Time and space are only necessary to make that choice. But once you have made that choice and you decide, or you feel that your perception is one of me as your foundation, you won't need time or space. and therefore you will suddenly become a sense of self which is eternal outside of time and space. So therefore we see that the body and the soul, which is inside, have two perceptions which are opposite each other. One perception leads to kiyum, existence. It leads to your survival, the appearance of unity. It leads to your survival, your awareness of unity, and the other awareness leads to annihilation, which is the perception of separation. And after you've made that choice, I will make you eternal, and you will coexist with me in a certain way, outside of time and space. So eternity is not infinite time and infinite space. Eternity is no time and no space. I will remove the two dimensions of time and space. There will be no such thing as a space-time continuum. The space and time will no longer exist because you will no longer be involved in the task of choosing between two possible perceptions. So your body, if you live or listen to your body and you don't keep my commandments because you think I'm outside of you as a separate entity, that will lead to annihilation, or what's called in Hebrew, ibud. That will lead to the conclusion of annihilation. But if you listen to me and you unify with me as a foundation of your being, you will lead to true existence, which is called kiyum. So the body leads to ibud. Listening to the body and not doing the commandments leads to ibud. And the soul leads to kiyum, which is eternity, no time and no space. So the world in which you will be united with body and soul and have to choose a specific perception is called Olam Hazeh, this world. And finally, the world where you will be able to exist forever, eternally, will be called Olam Haba, the future world. And Olam Haba will start after Olam Hazeh, after the union of the physical and the spiritual together, to give you a choice between what perception you will have, and then you will do my commandments. You will then go to a new world, to a process called zichur, where your soul will suddenly minimize the separation between me and you. And you will have your body because you will have your sense of myself, but it will no longer constitute a separation between us. So body and soul will both connect to each other permanently, in a permanent way, with a soul and its perception of relationship and perception of union will overwhelm the body and take away the fact that you are separate from me in certain ways, which comes from your sense of self-awareness. So now we go to the actual action of the Zulosai in his choice of perceptions. I will give you free will. But to give you free will, I first have to separate you from your mind. That's right. Because if you are your mind, if you two are the same thing, you cannot choose. Because your mind will become your nature. And if your mind represents your nature, you cannot change your nature. So therefore, I will separate your mind from your sense of self. I will separate your sense of self-awareness from the sense of self so that you can choose what your self-awareness will be like, what your perception will be like. Either it contains me or it doesn't. I'm outside of it. So then suddenly your mind will be connected to yourself as an outside entity. What will connect it to? How will your choice, your free choice of choosing who you are, be embedded into your being of body and soul? How will it do that? By what's called the creation of the angels. I will create forces that will unify your mind and your soul, your sense of self. And what would unify the two, your sense of self and your mind, so that your choice becomes you, eventually your choice will become your sense of self, and your awareness and self will come together. But while it's separated so that you can choose between one perception or another, angels will be created that will represent exactly who you are. If you choose to do a sin and not follow my commandments, you will create an angel or a consciousness of sin, an entity who has a consciousness of sin. And if you believe that I'm not outside you, that angel will represent a consciousness of union, which will be, and gradually, eventually, when you make your choices through free will, I will restore the unity of your mind and sense of self, where your sense of self will be responsible for the self-awareness that it possesses. And you will become one being of body and soul. Your body and soul will disappear as the entities that they now are, and eventually you will become a sense of self possessing an innate action of self-awareness which will go on for eternity. Because you are nothing more than a self, just like I am nothing more than a self, God says. I am the essence of self-awareness. I am self-awareness itself. You were given the gift of possessing self-awareness. But in certain senses, we are really a principle and an image. In a certain sense, you're my image. Because you also have a sense of self-awareness. You are not an entity of self-awareness in the sense that you are self-awareness itself, but you possess the gift of self-awareness. And in that way, you are my image. But in the world of body and soul is where you have to make the choice. And that choice will be given to you through free will. And free will only becomes possible because I'm going to separate your self-awareness from your sense of self, or your mind from your sense of self. So therefore, you will be outside of yourself in a certain way, and you will be able to choose to what is the correct perception. So now we look at the history of this. What's the history of this choice? Well, the first man that God created was Adam. That was the first man. And God separated his wife from him, so there was just Adam and Eve, and he was given the commandment not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What did he do? He had a Yetzer Hara, which is an evil inclination, which promoted the perception of what? Separation. And there was a good inclination called the Yetzer Tov, which promoted the impulse of union. He had to choose between the two. Before the sin, before he did the sin, these were impulses. But once he sinned, he gave the concept of separation much greater power. So what happened was the awareness of separation became much more real. His body suddenly changed when he sinned, and he asserted the perception that he's separate from God. Suddenly the physical universe became much more an aspect of individuation. It became much more prone to individuals. Everything appeared to a much more powerful degree as individual and separated. The concept of union became much weaker, and the concept of separation became much stronger. So therefore, the whole universe changed. Whereas before with Adam, before he sinned, the physical and the spiritual universe were connected. Adam never experienced any separation between his guf or neshama, between his body and soul. They were not separate. One was in terms of the other, and he shared two consciousness. He shared the consciousness of separation, which came from his body, and he shared the consciousness of union, which came from his soul. But these two levels of consciousness were incorporated into one body, composed of a body and a soul together. So therefore what we see is an amazing thing. Adam never died. Death was not applicable to Adam. That's right. There was no such thing as death. Why? Because death is nothing more than the separation of the body and the soul, where each one goes to its own universe. The body remains in the physical universe, and the soul does what? And the soul remains in the spiritual universe. So everything changed. Two new universes were created after the sin. The spiritual universe of the soul and the physical universe of the body. And the two of these became separated. No longer was the body and the soul together. You see. But the body and the soul always remained connected on some level. They never truly separated, and they never totally separated. Why? Because if the body and the soul truly separate permanently, where they're no longer connecting at all, that results in annihilation. And that's what's supposed to happen according to the attribute of justice. If the person chose to do a sin and not listen to the voice of God, his body and soul would begin to separate, and then finally would separate completely. And then the body and the soul exist on two separate universes, completely separate, being completely unattached. That results in annihilation. Why? Because the self is suddenly divorced from self-awareness permanently. Since the self is occupied with the activity or the action of self-awareness, it cannot be truly disconnected from it. It can be separated and distanced from it, but it cannot be separated. The self, which is the entity, performs the action of self-awareness, which is the way that the self knows that it exists. And if these two, self and self-awareness, are suddenly separated, where the entity is separated from its action, that is annihilation. And that's the attribute of justice. So therefore, what's supposed to happen according to the attribute of justice is that the self, the body, should become completely separated from the soul, totally separated into two separate universes, and immediately both universes would be annihilated, because the person would no longer be a legitimate entity. He would no longer be a self united with the activity, the action of separation, the action of self-awareness, of existence. So the consequence of din or justice is annihilation. And it only occurs when a person does a sin and doesn't listen to God and sees himself as separate and obeys the illusion of separation. Then suddenly he separates from body and soul, and he's annihilated. This is a very important concept to understand. The body represents the aspect of separation which comes from the perception of me. You see, you have to understand where the body comes from. It comes from the perception of me and myself, which feels that it's outside of everything else, and it perceives, reality proceeds from it. That's the concept of the body. Therefore, the body represents the concept of the self. The soul represents the concept of union with God. So therefore, the soul represents a universe which indicates absolute union with everything. So when these two lenses produce two different perceptions, that these two perceptions are united, you serve a certain unity between self and self-awareness, even though it's mediated by angels, because the mind and self are somewhat separated, but they're not totally separated, so that you can have free choice and choose which perception you represent. But if you sin and you choose one of these choices, if you choose the world of the body and the world of sin and the world of ego, where you suddenly see God is outside, then the soul, according to the attribute of justice, should become completely separated from the sense of self. Body and soul are separated. Two lenses separate and become two different realities which point to annihilation. So what did God do? How did God prevent annihilation? Because God loves the Zulosai. He loves the human being. And he doesn't want to annihilate him. He wants him to succeed. But how can he succeed after he just created, fortified the consciousness of separation? So what God does is something very bizarre. What he does is he takes the soul out of the body slowly and into a different universe. But these two universes are in contact. They are unified. They unify at the edges. It's like instead of having two circles which coincide in each other, where the edge of one circle is contained in another circle, so that there are two universes which are connected and they have contact, God therefore begins to separate them so that the soul can leave the universe of physical and become a separate universe itself. But it always retains a certain level of union because the soul always remains in contact body. But what happens to the body? Because the soul leaves the body, its sense of life leaves the body. Because life comes from self-awareness. It comes from the connection to God. And when the soul leaves the body, how? Why? Because the body is dying. That's what death is. What is death? Death is the separation of the body and soul. But what is the result of death? As the soul leaves the body, what happens? Well, what happens is called aging. Because what is aging? Before you die, you're born as a child and then you grow up. And then you age. And then the body becomes weaker and becomes prone to sickness and so on. All the organs begin to disintegrate in a certain way. If you look at an old person, you see suddenly he's completely different than a young person. The young person was vigorous and strong and vital and healthy. But the older person is automatically unhealthy. Why? Because he's aging. What is aging? Aging is nothing more when the body and soul approach the possibility of death. And death is the ultimate result. Because what is death? What is death? Death is the beginning of the separation of the body and soul slowly. In other words, death is the actual action of ibud, annihilation. Instead of God annihilating the body and soul by permanently separating the two, he only temporarily separates them. And they still remain connected. But as they begin to separate, the body begins to age. Aging is nothing more than weakening of the body, developing pains. The body is in pain because of aging. The memory goes, the imagination goes, the life goes, the strength goes. So therefore, physicality is waning, not waxing, it's waning. From the person as a youth, he's strong and vital. And as he ages, he approaches death. What he's really doing is he's going through a process of ibud, progressive, gradual ibud. So that's how God saves them. And that is the attribute of mercy. What is the attribute of mercy? The attribute of justice is the complete, fixed, permanent separation between body and soul, so that the self is separated from the self-awareness. The person instantly is annihilated. But instead, what God does, he begins to separate the body and soul. And that results in the body appearing as it ages, because it's losing its life. So therefore we see that death is nothing more than a gradual process of ibud, annihilation. Instead of God annihilating the union of body and soul suddenly, he annihilates it progressively, slowly. But he never truly annihilates it. So the soul leaves the body, but remains in touch with the body. That's why when the soul comes back on a Yud-Site, at the annual day of death of the person, the soul comes back down to the grave. How does the soul know where the body is, since the body is now in the physical ground? How does the soul know where the body is? Because it's still connected to the body. It's connected in some way through the body, and that connection never ceases. Because if it ceased, and the attitude of justice would take over, would be annihilated. It never ceases. And therefore, the soul can come back to the body eventually. And that's the resurrection of the dead. Since the soul never truly separates from the body, it's able to return. And God has provided that at the end of time, the soul will come back to the body, and the body will no longer be physical. It will become spiritual. That's called the resurrection of the dead. Why? Because God never had the intention of totally separating the body and the soul, since they represented two important aspects of the body, the self and the self-awareness, which is the real person, manifested in the lenses of the body and soul. And those two lenses were never supposed to be separated. The person was never supposed to die. Death was never supposed to happen in the world. Even in the physical universe, there was no such thing as the law of entropy, where energy gradually subsides or becomes useless. In physics, they have something called entropy, the third law of thermodynamics, where energy is dispensed and dispersed and eventually becomes useless. It becomes valueless, useless. You cannot use it anymore. But that's akin to death. But the body is supposed to only mimic the annihilation. That's the act of mercy, where the body doesn't actually become annihilated by the separation of body and soul permanently, but only temporarily, and they remained in some level of contact. But it's the intention of God to one day remove sin from the body and soul and unite the body and soul again completely. So that's the concept of the resurrection of the dead. And from the resurrection of the dead, once the soul goes back into the body, then suddenly the universe is again supposed to resurrect in another way. Time and space will also disappear. So the resurrection of the dead is called the tahara, for purification of the body and soul, where it comes back together. But when the body begins and soul unite and slowly begin to lose their occupation in time and space, when time and space begins to disappear, that's called Kedusha. And that's why there are two Mashiachs, two Messiahs. One is called the Mashiach ben David, who's responsible for the elimination of time and space, and that is responsible for the production of Kedusha. And then there's another Mashiach who's created after the sin, called the Mashiach ben Yosef, where he's responsible for the resurrection of the dead and for the Geula itself. Because what does the word Geula mean? The word Geula means redemption. Redemption of what? What is being redeemed? Well, the redemption applies to the separation of body and soul. That's what redemption means. That's what the word Geula means. Most people have no idea. Most people think that Geula or redemption, when the Mashiach comes, especially the Mashiach ben Yosef, that simply means that a Messiah will appear and bring all the Jews back to Israel, and the Jews will live in Israel, and they will not be oppressed by the nations of the world. That's redemption. No, that's not redemption. That's only a temporary redemption. But the real redemption refers to the fact that suddenly the physicality, the intensification of the annihilation as a progressive activity doesn't take place. Death is removed. The soul comes back into the body and becomes unified with the body like it was with Adam before the sin. So physicality did not become stronger. Physicality is then slowly removed. The physicality, the excessive physicality, which was created through the sin, above that of the spirit, where the body became more powerful than the soul, stronger than the soul, and the perception of separation between man and God became stronger. After the sin, Adam truly saw, not only did he believe, not that he only had a perception that what he was outside of God, but he actually saw that. He saw everything suddenly become totally separate. And he believed that God was outside of man. The consciousness of both was separate, individual. And God is separate from man. That happened after the sin, because the concept of separation becomes even stronger. The lens of the eyes becomes even stronger. When everything, all entities are seen as separate from each other, as outside of each other. In Adam, before the sin, when the soul was in the body and attached to the body, he had two different perceptions, two contrary perceptions, that everything is separate and everything is unified. And he had to choose between which one was real. But after the sin, the body became stronger. The ratio of the body to the soul became much stronger. Whereas before the sin, the ratio of the body and the soul, the ratio of what? Of separation to unification, the ratio of physicality to spirituality, as a ratio, as a comparison between these two things, were equal, 50% and 50%. The person had a 50% figure that he saw everything as separate, and 50% everything as unified. His soul is what contributed to the unified perception of 50%, and his body was responsible through the eyes of separation. But after the sin, that ratio changed, and the ratio of separation becomes much greater. The eyes had a much greater perception than the soul. So now, after the sin, man can no longer see from a soul. Before the sin, Adam Mauritian was able to see from his soul and from his body. He had two opposite perceptions at the same time, which he had to choose from, because body and soul were united in a certain way. They were only different in their perceptions, but they were united in a certain way. And in a certain way they were separated. But after he sinned, he absorbed the energy of sin, making the body much stronger than the soul. So therefore, the person could no longer see through the eyes of the soul. He could only see through the eyes of the body. So that's when man became physical. And as soon as man became physical, the only way God can save man is by letting him annihilate gradually. And that was the process of aging and the absorption of pain. Pain and aging comes from what? Comes from the process of annihilation, which happened because Adam sinned and made physicality much stronger, and therefore initiated the concept of ibud, of annihilation. So therefore, the person after the sin entered the world of physicality totally, when he no longer could see through the eyes of his soul. His nous was outside of the body in a certain sense, even though there was an aspect of the soul that was connected to the soul, and that gives him life. But the powerful aspect of the body reigns supreme in the person. But it's the intention of God, therefore, the only way God could save him through the attribute of mercy, by initiating the attribute, the concept of annihilation, slowly, and not letting it finish. So that eventually, at the end of time, there would come a certain time when suddenly the body the soul re-enters the body. And that's called the resurrection of the dead. And that's called tahara, purification. It's a purification of the process of annihilation. That's what it means. It's a purification of the process of annihilation. Aging will stop, death will stop. No longer will mankind die. After the resurrection of the dead, mankind will never die. Nothing will die. Death will leave the world permanently, and the soul and the body will remain united. And from that starts the second process. It's not the process of the Mashiach ben Yosef, of the process of the Messiah, the son of David. And that process is the process called Kedusha, or holiness, where not only will the soul unite with the body and become one entity, but actually time and space itself will disappear, because the person will have done his job. He will have made his choice. He will have made his choice between whether he's united, the awareness of union, or whether he's separated from God, the awareness of separation. But that choice will become embedded in the relationship between his body and soul. And therefore, we will become different beings in the future world, completely different than the way we are now. So therefore we see the introduction of death is the introduction of annihilation as a process, but a process which occurs gradually, where the person becomes weaker, where his life begins to ebb, it begins to go, where he waxes, where he wanes. And eventually the soul leaves the body, the person dies, and the person is buried in the ground, and the body disintegrates. And when the body disintegrates in the ground, by that way, the body will have give up its impurity. And after the body gives up its impurity of sin, the soul will re-enter the body and replenish it and reinforce it and rebuild it. And that's the resurrection of the dead, which is nothing more than the person will become like Adam before the sin. You see, the whole purpose of death and everything that we go through pain is simply to restore that which Adam, the first man, was. Because Adam before the sin was much more spiritual. How do we know? Because where did Adam live before the sin? He lived in what was called Gan Eden. That's where he lived before the sin. And that's where the soul and the body were totally connected together. But where is Gan Eden now? Where is the Garden of Eden now? Well, we believe that the Garden of Eden is, you go there after you die. After you die and you are cleansed of your sin, you go to the Garden of Eden, which is a completely spiritual universe that's a world of ecstasy. It's like a temporary Olam Haba, future world. The Garden of Eden is a place of ecstasy. But the question is, how can it be a world of ecstasy? Well, what does that mean? Adam lived in a world of ecstasy? Yes. What that means that Adam, before he sinned and unequalized the body and the soul, he was much more spiritual. And his impulse of union or of separation was much weaker. It was much easier for him to not to do a sin. But when he did the sin, Gan Eden, therefore, became spiritual. It became Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, where Adam lived and where he was, became a world. It became a place of spiritual world. Gan Eden today is contained in the spiritual world. Souls are in Gan Eden, not bodies. The body lies in the ground, separating, disintegrating. And where does the soul go? It goes to Gan Eden, the Gan Eden of the spiritual world. So therefore, Adam Rishon changed when he became much more physical. Gan Eden became a spiritual world. The nature of Adam Rishon before the sin, he was much higher spiritually. So this is what will happen by the resurrection of the dead. But the question is, how will it happen? Because what makes the world more physical is a concept of a word called Zohar. What is Zohar? It's very important to understand. Zohar means contamination. And what does this mean, contamination? This is the sin becoming part of your body. The sin was no longer an impulse coming from the body. It really was a reality of the body. And therefore, the physical body became much more opaque. Whereas before the physical body was translucent, it could become much more spiritual suddenly. But after the sin, it became opaque, which means the contamination of the energy of sin invaded the body, and it changes the ratio of physicality to spirituality. Whereas before, spirituality was contained, before the sin, spirituality was contained in the body as an equal ratio, where the person was able to perceive an aspect of separation from the body and an aspect of what? Of union of him and God from the soul. Now, those perceptions were totally separated, almost totally separated, where one was in a different universe entirely from the other, but they were still connected. So the ratio between the ratio of the perception of the body and the perception of the soul changed after the sin. It became much greater weight in terms of the body than the soul. It will be resurrected at the resurrection of the dead. It will again become equal to the resurrection of the dead, and from there it will change. And Mashiach ben David, he will eliminate time and space, and that will produce eternity, the future world. So after the resurrection of the dead, which will occur in the redemption of the Mashiach, that resurrection of the dead will first be performed by the Mashiach ben Yosef, who is responsible for restoring the balance between physicality and spirituality. And after the two are restored, when the soul goes back into the body and the body becomes whole again and the body is resurrected, all the graves, all the people in the graves will leave their graves, and they will stand up again and become a completely human being. From then on, will start a new period called the period of Kedusha, where holiness means eliminating the concept of time and space, because there's no more choice between union and separation. And as time and space disappear, you gradually go to Olam Haba, and that becomes eternity. So we see, because of the sin of Adam, the process of going to eternity has to include a previous process of resurrection of the dead. If Adam had never sinned, he would never have died. There would be no death. There would be no separation of the body and the soul. But suddenly, his body would be completely purified, and it would lack its time and spatial elements, and it would become eternal. So the body and the soul would become eternal together. If Adam had never sinned, he would never have died. Because Adam had died, he therefore forced the possibility of what? Of death, which is gradual annihilation, where the body and the soul separate to a large degree, and the ratio between the two changes. So we're therefore, in all of history, that's what's happening. Zoma, or contamination, is continually produced where the person becomes more and more physical. And that's what Zoma is. It's the ascendancy of physicality and the ascendancy of separation. It's when the possibility of perceiving God and feeling God becomes much weaker and weaker and weaker. And that's what history is. Adam, after the sin, that he produced children who were individual. And these children who Adam produced began to sin more and more. And with each one of the sins, God had to what? Produce mercy, where he had to make body more and more physical. So that produces more and more darkness. Because the greater the physical universe, the greater is the illusion of separation between man and God. So now, in the 20th century, the illusion between man and God is almost completely there. How? Because one of the reasons why mankind has discovered science and developed a thing is Zohar produces not only the illusion of separation, it produces the illusion of power. And this is where it comes in. Adam, before the sin, had the illusion of separation, and this is what he had to contest by keeping the commandment. But after he committed the sin, he developed a second illusion, which was not only that he was separate from God, but that he also had power like God, and he could do things. And the more he sinned, the more the illusion of power came to him. So this is throughout history, where mankind is becoming more and more powerful. And finally, in modern history, mankind has become extremely powerful because of the initiation of science. God has given the man the knowledge of science to create, to accentuate and emphasize that man has power. That's the reason why God has given man the knowledge of science, where mankind has power, so that a new category of darkness entered the world, the category of atheism. For most of human history, man believed that God existed, but man believed that God was outside of him, was separate. But finally, towards the end of history, towards the end of time, man develops a new illusion of power, to such an extent that he not only believes that he's separated from God, he not only believes that he has power like God, but he believes that there is no God. So the concept of atheism is the worst level of what? Of the darkness of Zorma, which is the energy of sin becoming more and more physical. So therefore, we see that throughout history, mankind has changed, where he's become more and more evil, more and more in the belief of separation, more and more in the belief that he's powerful, finally to believe that there is no God. The fact of the matter is, many scientists, in fact, maybe the majority of scientists, don't believe in the existence of God. Even though they see the incredible act of creation, they see how creation, the physical universe, obeys the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, the laws of biology. They see the concept of law, the regularity of the universe, and anything which has regularity has design. And anything which is designed as a designer. It's like, what do you call it? I think someone once said, for me to believe that there is no God is like believing that a hurricane goes through a junkyard full of junk, and as it goes through, a tornado goes through a junkyard, and out comes the product of that meeting is a Boeing 747, a plane. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. That if a tornado goes to a junkyard, it takes all these pieces together and makes it into a plane. Well, a plane is a designed object. A plane is based on principles of science, principles of laws of physics, principles of mechanical engineering, aeronautical engineering. It needs a designer. It can't appear randomly on its own, but there are many scientists who believe that the universe appeared randomly. But they have the belief in separation, which is so powerful. They believe that the me of a scientist, the me of a man, is so powerful that he is powerful. And not only that, that God doesn't even exist anymore. He's willing to say that all the laws of the universe, the laws of physics, which are so regular and so predictable, were random. They just happened by chance. That's ridiculous. And anybody who understands the concept of design, having a designer, understands that's impossible. If you're walking in the desert and suddenly you see an object which is a typewriter, and you see that it can do typing, you don't believe that it appeared by itself randomly. You would never believe that. You would have believed it must have been created by somebody. Somebody had to make that typewriter, which now sits in the desert. Why? Because such an object which obeys laws, it obeys regularity with such incredible reasoning and incredible force, had to have a designer. You would never look at an object which has total design as being created by random chance. But the illusion of separation is so great. The Zorma of mankind throughout its history has produced so many sins that now much of mankind doesn't even believe that God exists. So therefore we see the power. So therefore, what happens in the day of the redemption? What happens is redemption. The first redemption exists in two parts. Redemption exists in the removal of death, in mankind returning to the same state of Adam, where the possibility of the perception of union and the perception of separation appear together in one body. That the soul and the body of man is one. But after the sin, they become separate with a minimal amount of contact. And man begins to believe more and more in physicality, to the extent that now we believe not only is he separated from God, there's a me in you, but there's a me which is powerful like you. And now with the concepts of science and so on, mankind believes he has the same power of God. And he doesn't even believe that there's a God. And why has God done this? He has allowed man to erode to such a level where he doesn't even accept the existence of God, the acceptance of a designer who must exist to produce a design. Why has he done this? Because he's trying to save mankind. He's trying to let annihilation occur to such an extent where it actually occurs, it annihilates God. That's right. The process of annihilation, which started with death, so it's progressive, where the person gradually separates the soul from the body, now comes to the point where it annihilates God himself. And why does he do this? Because mankind's ability to have free will has been minimized. It's shortened. The greater the illusion of separation, the greater the illusion of power, the greater the possibility, the greater is the separation from God. And therefore, since man develops into an environment which is fundamentally atheistic to a large extent, where science has completely replaced God, mankind is really not accountable. So God wants to remove the accountability of man in doing sins, but he doesn't remove the responsibility. When a man does a sin, he's responsible, because the man does a sin because he's brought up completely with the doubt whether God exists or not, because now he believes in science. He's really not accountable. It's not his fault. So his free will has been minimized. So therefore, what human history has done is minimize the accountability of man. Why? Because God wants to save man. So even though mankind is not worthy of a high level of eternity, he will be worthy of a low level of eternity. And if he's not worthy of a low level of eternity, he will be worthy of a lower level of eternity. So therefore, the future world, which is called eternity, which no longer has time and space, exists on a million different levels. So depending on whether the person is accountable, it's that level which he goes to. Why? Because God does not want to destroy mankind. He loves mankind, his creation, and he does not want to destroy him. So therefore, a person is innocent if he's not accountable. And a person is not accountable if he doesn't even know that what he's doing is a sin. So therefore, today, 92% of the Jewish people no longer keep any commandments, except some commandments between man and man. What does that mean? God has removed their accountability on purpose. When God destroyed the temple, he removed all those commandments which were associated with sacrifices. And when he took us out of Israel, God has removed all those commandments which are associated with the land of Israel. Why did he do that? Why did he confiscate many of those commandments? So out of the 613 original commandments which the Jewish people were given, maybe there's a couple of hundred left, and that's it. Why has God done this? Why has he removed that? So he's made many societies godless, because he's removing the accountability when man grows up in an environment where he doesn't know anything. He doesn't know exactly what he has to do. So therefore, mankind is given a much lower level of free will, and therefore he gets a much lower level of eternity. So God has changed the whole picture, whereas Adam before the sin was capable of connecting to all of eternity. Now we connect to eternity only in bits and pieces. That's right. Mankind does go to eternity, at least most of mankind does, except for very evil people. But they do go to eternity. But how? In very low levels of eternity. Even though they live forever without time and space, but their ecstasy is much less with each lower level. And these lower levels are produced by lower levels of ecstasy. But it's still a great level of ecstasy, but these are lower levels of ecstasy. Why? Because the person in some level has to exhibit his difficulty in connecting to God. Since the person did not have a real good connection to God when he was a physical human being, his level in eternity is a low level of connection to God. And the lower level that you're connected to God, the less ecstasy and joy that you have. So therefore, the future world was created in many different parts. in many different levels, where each level has a certain level of ecstasy and joy. And that depends on the level of connection that you have to God in the physical life. The more connection you have to God in the physical life, the greater the level of your eternity for joy and ecstasy. And that's how it goes. There's maybe 1 million different levels of residence in the future world of eternity. Each level being dependent on how connected you are to God, how much you believed in Him, and how much you saw Him and loved Him, and you did not see Him as a you. The more you saw God as a you, the lower level of eternity that you reward. But we see before you can go eternity, what first has to be done is the separation of body and soul has to be reconstituted. It has to be restored. Because until the soul goes in the body, which it went out of the body when man sinned, you cannot have the future world. So therefore, the soul has to go back into the body, which is called the resurrection of the dead. Well, the question is, how does that happen? That's a good question. But I will tell you one aspect of that. As long as man is capable of sinning, and as long as he sins, the soul and the body will be disconnected to a large extent, so there will be two universes, the physical and the spiritual. That will exist to the end of time, until the ability to have free will disappear. The ability to sin will disappear. But it means that the fundamental mechanism of human history is not the mechanism of freedom of choice between separation and union with God. It's the mechanism of the manifestation of sin. And the manifestation of sin, while there's a period of sinning, will be called Zohar. And that manifestation of sin is a continuous increase in darkness and in pain. A continuous increase. And that's called Zohar. And that increase is designed to give a person a share in the eternal world, even though it's a small share. It's designed to make man unaccountable so that he can go to eternity. But there will come a point in time when this will change, when the process of Zohar, or the process of darkness and evil, will no longer grow by virtue of your sins. Instead, what will happen is that the contamination which exists in the physical universe because of sins will be there, but it will be able to be removed. That's the point. The important point is this. As long as man keeps on sinning, and as long as he has free will to sin, and he does sin, Zohar will exist. There will be continuously an increase in darkness, in the knowledge of God, who God is, that we are not separate from Him, we do not have power really from ourselves, and of course He exists. As long as the darkness that creates these three illusions exists, and it gets greater and greater, Zohar, this increasing darkness will not disappear. But when the soul goes back into the body, and so on, then the Zohar will disappear completely. And suddenly everyone will know about the existence of God. Like it says, and the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of God, like the waters cover the sea. That is the redemption. When that darkness disappears, and suddenly there is incredible light, and that light appears because the soul goes back into the body, that is the beginning of eternity. But that's going to happen in two stages. The first stage is where the process of darkness or Zohar continues, and that will continue as sins and so on. And then there will come a certain point when suddenly that process will no longer continue, and the process of Ibud, the process of death, all these processes of the increase of darkness will stop. But will it disappear? No, it will still be there. But it will be like a suit of clothes where you can put it on and you can take it off. So as long as this process of Zohar, where darkness invades the world, will get greater and greater, you cannot remove the Zohar. So therefore you cannot produce eternity. But on the day that this process stops, where even though there is darkness in the world, but that darkness is not fixed, it's capable of being removed. In other words, the Zorma, right now, Zorma, contamination from sin, is like our skin. That's right. It's connected to the body. It cannot be removed. It cannot be removed. You are in your skin. Your skin is part of you, because contamination, which is produced from sin, is designed to save us. Because God created the concept of gradual annihilation without getting to actual annihilation. He does not go to actual annihilation. We simply get old and we die. We gradually are annihilated. But it's not actual annihilation, because annihilation does not occur. It stops. So there will come a point in time when the process of gradual annihilation would stop. We will no longer die. Yes. And at that point, the contamination, which tends to bring us to annihilation, at that point, then it will no longer be skin. It will become our clothes. So we will be able to take it off. Right. You can take clothes off, but you cannot take skin off. So since the sin of Adam Rishon, Zorma, which is the contamination of sin in the physical universe, which makes darkness of physicality much stronger, becomes our skin, the skin of humanity, so that the existence of God is hidden totally, so mankind finally becomes atheists to that level. But when that darkness ceases, when the process of increasing darkness ceases, that darkness will no longer be our skin, it will be our clothes, and we will be able to remove it. And that is the day of redemption. You see, the redemption does not mean that the Mashiach appears in person and we know who the Mashiach is. The day of the Geula, the day of redemption, is the day when the contamination called Zoema will stop increasing. It suddenly will no longer be frozen as our skin. It will become rather our clothes. And then it could be removed. And how is it removed? How could you remove this contamination which was caused by our sin? By the increase of knowledge. And what knowledge is that? What does the Mashiach do when he arrives? What's the main thing he does? So people think the main thing he will do is take all the Jews out of the land of all their foreign countries and they will bring them to Israel. That's what they believe, that the Mashiach will restore the land of Israel to the Jews and the temple. No, that's not the main thing that he does. Really, it's not. What is the main thing that he does? He will give knowledge to the world. The 50th gate. What is the 50th gate? Because when when Moses went up to the mountain and to receive the Torah, he will receive the Torah in the 50th gate. The Torah is composed of 50 gates of wisdom, what's called Nun Sharei Bina. And the 50th gate is the Messianic light. All other 49 gates is not. And when the Jews worshiped the golden calf, they suddenly lost the 50th gate. You know, the 50th gate were 2 tablets that were brought down by Moshe Rabbeinu from Mount Sinai to the Jews. But when Moshe Rabbeinu saw them worshiping the golden calf, he broke them and he threw the tablets down in the Jews, and the tablets broke. And then Moshe Rabbeinu had to go up to the mountain and receive new tablets, which are the tablets from the first 49 gates. But the world was never worthy of having the 50th gate, the Messianic light. It's extremely important to understand this. When it says, a new light will shine on Israel at the redemption, what does that mean, a new light? It means the 50th gate. And that gate reveals information and knowledge that has never been known before. It reconciles science with spirituality. It explains all the contradictions and questions that scientists have about physics and biology and chemistry. It also gives you complete knowledge of the spirit universe. It's the absorption of total knowledge in the world, which was supposed to have arrived on the first tablets, that were broken by Moshe Rabbeinu on the holiday of Tabernacles or the holiday of Shavuos. So therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu had to go up to the mountain again and receive what was called the second tablets on the holiday of Yom Kippur. So therefore, we have two tablets. We have a set of broken tablets, which is the 50th gate and the Messianic light. And we have the 49 gates for, which do not have the 50th gate. So therefore, as long as we have the first 49 gates, we do not have the wisdom that allows us to take off Zoma and darkness. It's only the 50th gate will give us the true meaning of all knowledge. Mankind will suddenly be aware of why everything happened to him. Every person will suddenly understand why everything happened to him in his life. His childhood, his adulthood, his teenager, his adulthood, why he died at a certain age, who he married, who his friends were, and so on. He will understand every aspect of every event in his life. He will have the knowledge of the 50th gate. That is the knowledge of the 50th gate. And that's it says in Ecclesiastes, in Koheles, Al Kol Davar Yova Mishpat. Everything will become justice, and mankind will know the entire justice of God. God will reveal to mankind why he did everything that he did. Mankind will know the reason for that, and God will explain it to him. And then from that time on, when that knowledge becomes, and who will give us that knowledge? The Mashiach. Who? The Mashiach ben Yosef. The same Mashiach who will eliminate the concept of Zohar or darkness is the one who's going to give us this knowledge. Through the Mashiach ben Yosef, he has this knowledge. And then from the Mashiach ben Yosef, this knowledge will come to what? To mankind. And then suddenly the process of the physicalization of what? Of the awareness, that the awareness of separation becomes stronger and stronger, will stop, and it will become, instead of a skin, it will become like those clothes that we wear, which we'll be able to take off. And that's what will happen on the day of the redemption. The day of the redemption is the day when the process of the increase of Zohar on the Bria, darkness becoming greater and greater, will stop growing. Skin will become a suit of clothes. It will be able to be removed. How will it be removed? Through increasing knowledge of the 50th gate. Man is nothing more than a union. It's a source of wisdom. Mankind is nothing more than a self, having what? Self-awareness. So therefore, mankind relates to reality as a perception. So if you change the perception of mankind, you change the nature of reality, because the reality that appears to man appears to his eyes, and there's an image on his mind. That's all reality is. We are not in direct contact with reality. We are indirect contacting. When we simply see the way our mind forms an image of man, of reality. We are never in contact with reality itself. Sight is nothing more than an image in our brain. Touching is nothing more. Hardness is an image in our brain. Hearing is an image in our brain. Tasting is an image in the brain. Smelling is an image in the brain. We do not have contact with reality. We have contact with our minds. We have contact with the image of what our minds, through the senses, produce of reality. So therefore, the human being is nothing more than a mind. His essence is a mind. He is nothing more than what? A sense of self, having a sense of self-awareness. That's all we are. It is God who has created everything. It's God who does everything. The human being really has no power, because everything which is done through the body. But you don't control the body. You don't even know what your body does. When you digest your food, you have no idea what you're doing. Your body is doing it. In a certain sense, you are separated of your body. You are your mind, and then there's your body. It's your body which does all things, even movement. You don't know how to move. When you raise your fingers, you're not doing it. Your body is doing it. In some way, 50 million muscle cells are moving, contracting at the same time. Well, who is doing that? I'm not doing it. I don't even know what I do when I move my finger. All I know is I have an intention. The only thing that a human being has is will, his intention. And suddenly he intends to move his finger, and his finger moves. What is the connection between the movement of the finger, which is done by millions of muscle cells, and the intention of will? We don't know. We have no idea how my intention connects to doing things. So therefore we see who does everything. God does. God is the executive of the body. God is in the body. His power is in the body. He does everything for us. He does our circulation. He does our digestion. He does our movement. He does our thinking. We are not really responsible for anything except to be self-aware. And God wants to correct our self-awareness so that we are not annihilated by contradiction, the yichud pressure. That's all reality is. All reality is nothing more than harmonizing with God, knowing who truly God is, that He is the ultimate presence, He is the ultimate power. There is nothing else. A human being can do nothing except have an intention or will. That's all God granted us. And with that will, we make a choice between separation with God or union with God. That is it. And human history is nothing more than the gradual illusion of power so that we can separate with Him more and more. And when that process stops, that process is called Zohar. And when that process stops, what happens? And suddenly, Zohar, suddenly darkness no longer becomes our skin. It becomes our clothes. And that is the day of redemption. And that's the day that the Messiah, the energy of redemption, the energy of the Mashiach, and the energy of the 50th gate appears. Because suddenly reality changes. Why? Because our perception changes. Our perception of reality itself will change as we understand what God is doing. When we understand what God is doing and why He's doing it, that will be done through the 50th gate of the Torah. We will suddenly understand why everything happened in the world. And we will understand our relationship to everything in the world without exception. You will even understand your relationship to a spider that's walking in the Amazon jungle. Yes, you have a relationship with that spider. You have no idea what that is. But in the 50th gate, you will know what that is. You will know what that relationship is to a spider walking on the floor of the Amazon jungle. You will have a total knowledge of absolute unity. And as you see the unity of the universe in front of you, and suddenly you are cognitive of that universe, suddenly you are aware of what that relationship is, you suddenly will see who God is. That He is the source, the power, and the presence of absolute unity of everything that was made. So therefore, that's the day of the Geula. The Geula is the day of the transformation of Zohar from skin to clothes, and therefore death stops. And it's the day when suddenly the Messiah will arrive, and it's the beginning of the revelation of the 50th gate, so that we will understand and appreciate the absolute unity of God. What I described is the course of human history and the whole event of Adam Rishon Adam before the sin, and what happened because of the sin, the creation of Zohar, and what death is, and what annihilation is, and the concept of the consciousness of separation and the consciousness of the union between us and God. These are the true themes of the whole world. Everything else is an illusion. Everything else is a fantasy. You were given the greatest gift by God. What is that? The gift of myself, that you know you have a sense of me. Nothing in the universe has a sense of me like the human being, like the Zulosoi. And that sense of me will exist without time and without space, and it will exist eternally. And that's the gift of the image of God, the sense of me and the sense of you. We can't help that. But we can harmonize with God, even though we see Him as outside of us, by loving Him. then we will see him inside of us through the knowledge of the 50th gate, that he is the source, the presence, and the power of everything that exists. There are no exceptions. Ein od milvadoi, there is nothing else but him. And this is the concept of the Gula. On the day of the Gula is the day that Zoma will disappear, because it will be frozen. It will no longer be skin. It will transform and become a piece of clothes which can be removed. And then the soul will be able to go back into the body and suddenly become eternal by the disappearance of time and space. That's what will be in the future, and that's what we're all waiting for. That's what we were waiting for when we're all waiting for Mashiach. We're not waiting for the land of Israel. We're not waiting for the temple. We are waiting for the eternal union with God himself. But first we have to harmonize with that union by realizing he is part of us. He is not outside of us. And therefore, to do that, we have to love him. And that will create that sense of unity. That's the only reason why God made the world. That's all he expects from it. And that's all that will happen. Nothing else will happen.